Court is back in session.
Have the jury please remain standing for the jury. Please. Proceed, Mr. Prince.
All right, Mr. Knox, we had just finished talking about this directional blood swipe here on the door frame of Ms. Peters' bedroom. Was there anything else that we needed to cover on that, or were we finished there?
I think we finished that.
Okay. What are we looking at in this next photo?
This is just sort of an orientation photo just so you can see where the different bedrooms are. So you're looking down the hallway toward the front of the house, the front door being right there. And then you can see that the master bedroom is over here on the left. Twins' bedroom is over here on the right. Javante's bedroom here. And that's the direction of the hallway into the living room area.
Okay. So Ms. Peters, if she was fleeing from her bedroom towards the front door, would have turned left out of her door right there and gone down the hallway?
That's correct.
What are we looking at in this photo?
This is showing some various areas that were sample determined not to be blood, so we don't really have any blood deposited on the carpet. In this area, there's some blood that gets deposited further along down the hallway almost into the living room area.
What, if anything, does the low volume of blood deposit just outside the master bedroom and going down the hallway indicate to you, if anything?
Primarily that the majority of her injuries had not yet been inflicted. So you have the blood that appears to likely be from the left shoulder that's deposited on the doorway, a few other drops of blood in the bedroom, and that's about it. There's really not any other strong evidence of blood. That's going to be in stark contrast to what the foyer area looks like, where there's a heavy concentration of blood. So that means that the majority of her injuries have yet to be inflicted, and that will happen later.
And again, for a orientation perspective, this photo would be what you would see if you had walked out of Ms. Peters' bedroom, turned left like we were just talking about a second ago, and now we're facing down the hallway towards the front door.
That's correct.
What do we see in this photograph?
Here, again, another placard. It was an area sample, turned out not to be blood. So again, we don't have any blood deposited on the carpet in the space between her bedroom and almost to the end of the hallway.
And that gunshot wound to Ms. Peters' left shoulder, would that have been bleeding much at this point if it took place in the bedroom?
Probably not profusely. Gunshot wounds, depending on the nature of the wound, it can take a little while before blood actually really starts to come out of the wound, and then also things like clothing and so forth can absorb it, or sometimes somebody might be touching it, which again would slow down blood flow. So it's not uncommon for somebody to have suffered a gunshot wound and then be able to move from one area to another without depositing a significant amount of blood.
What do we see here?
Here we actually have areas where this number 8 placard here is representing where there is blood found. So you're beginning to see some blood deposition as we move toward the front of the house.
And just for orientation, again, this is if we're moving down the same hallway we're just looking at and talking about with Javante's bedroom on the right side here.
That's correct. This would be the front door right there in the living room area.
Okay. How about this slide?
This is showing a close-up of that blood area on the carpet, and basically just at the end of the hallway, almost into the living room area.
Okay. And this slide?
That's showing, and there's an overturned lamp right here in this area. It would look like the lamp was probably on that table and got knocked over and was overturned and on the floor near where that blood, the number 8 placard was.
And that table and lamp right there, they're some distance away from the front door still, correct?
That's correct, yes.
So whatever struggle took place around the front door and the foyer, that wouldn't have been the cause of this particular lamp getting knocked over?
That's correct, that's correct.
What do we see here?
There's some cast-off spatter on the hallway closet. So this is the closet we looked at earlier, has a bullet hole in it. There's some actual, what looks like cast-off or perhaps small impact stains, but most likely from cast-off. Small amounts of blood, and it's been deposited on the outside of that closet door.
And what, if anything, does that type of blood spatter indicate to you?
That can happen just through movement. So a person that's bleeding can be moving, particularly if somebody, say, is bleeding, touches their wound that has blood on it, and then perhaps moves their hand. So you could cast some blood off your hand from that. You could be cast off from your body from rapidly moving the body. So there are different ways that could occur. But again, what you're seeing is that in the hallway area near the bedroom and in the bedroom area, what blood we see is in very small quantities compared to what you'll see in the foyer.
Okay, so there's nothing to indicate in the hallway that she's being repeatedly struck and cast off coming off a weapon. It's just small quantities of blood consistent with movement.
That's right. Small quantities of blood. You can't exclude the possibility that it's something that's coming off of a weapon or it's being deposited by another person, but that could simply be something that she's depositing through moving rapidly out of the bedroom and down the hallway.
What type of blood spatter are we seeing in this photo?
Here you have some small amounts of blood that could be from impact stains or even dripped blood. Again, not much of a pattern to it, but there's very small quantities there. So again, it indicates that there's some bleeding going on here, but this is not consistent with the bulk of what happens in terms of the injuries and blood deposition later.
Okay, so again, blood spatter in the hallway consistent with movement.
That's correct. There could be some event going on here between her and another person, or this could be just blood that's being deposited from her moving rapidly and coming out of the bedroom and then heading down the hallway.
What, if anything, is significant about this next slide, this next photo we're looking at?
This is by the bedroom door for Javante's bedroom. And again, we've got a little bit more blood, small quantities. So you have a drop here, and it looks like possibly some other small ones, but mainly this larger drop here. That can be from just a dripping blood. It could be an impact stain of some type, but it's obviously being deposited again in small quantities.
Which door is this we're looking at?
That is Javante's bedroom door, and there's some couple of different bloodstain patterns, as you can see, that are marked. There's some rulers in place, and you can see a few different drops, mainly downward traveling drops, and up here what might be some transfer stains.
What, if anything, do the combination of the downward moving droplets as well as the blood transfer marks indicate to you?
Same as the rest of the blood in the hallway and stuff. Again, just that you have very small quantities. So if there's any type of violent event taking place, this is not the heavy kind of blunt force that happens later on. That there's this blood could be simply her own movements. It could be possibly from some interaction with another person, but it's very small quantities, meaning she doesn't have a lot of injury and a lot of blood that has come to the surface.
Is there enough blood with that transfer stain right there for you to be able to determine directionality?
Potentially so, but it's a pretty small quantity for determining direction.
Any indication based on what's there as to the direction of the swipe, or can that not really?
It appears to be that it's moving leftward in the photograph, and then of course you have these drops also that have sort of angles like this, so right to left and downward on the exterior of the door, which again would be consistent with some type of movement. So if you're say dripping or cast blood off as you're moving in that direction, or moving a hand or an object in that direction, then that's what you would expect to see would be that right to left and downward movement of those drops.
And that left-facing movement, that would be, in relation to this door, that would be moving down the hallway towards the foyer and the front door.
Yes,
This is close up the same.
it is. It is, yes.
That transfer mark off Javante's bedroom door.
That's correct.
What's this next photo we're looking at?
This is just showing another area with some dripped blood toward the bottom of the door on Javante's bedroom.
That's close up of the same.
That's true. That is, yes.
Is this still Javante's room, or is this a different part?
This is also Javante's bedroom, so this would be the door frame. The door that we just saw would open this way, and this would be the side of the door frame closest to the front door. And again, we have some small amounts of blood right there around that door frame.
All right. What have you taken note of in this next photo?
There's another blood stain on the wall, which would be just past Javante's bedroom. So again, that's his bedroom door. That's the front door. This is the living room area.
Is this a close-up of that blood stain in the hallway we were just talking about?
Yes.
And same thing, rightward to leftward motion, upward to downward motion.
That's correct, yeah. So you're talking right to left and downward, and the elongated nature of it means it's fairly close to the wall coming down. So again, that could be from a cast off, it could be a dripped blood dripping, it could be from an impact, but very small quantities still. So all through the hallway, we're looking at just small amounts of blood.
Is this the same or a different blood stain?
This is a different one. This is a little bit closer to the, again, you can see that table, this is the lamp on the ground, and then if you continued off to the left side of the photograph, you'd be in the living room area. So this is basically right near the end of the hallway, and there's some blood on the wall there.
Any conclusions drawn from that, or same as we've been discussing to this point?
Pretty much the same as what we've been discussing. Again, movements indicating going toward the front of the house, and it's small quantities, so not a lot of injury yet, not a lot of bloodletting yet.
This is close up the same?
Yes.
And I see you've got a couple of arrows there indicating direction. That's same as you've discussed, movement down the hallway towards the front door.
That's correct.
Is this another blood stain noted on the left side of the wall?
That is correct. Yes.
That's a close-up of that one?
That is, and the direction of that also is toward the front door. So left to right in this photograph would be toward the front door. Front door would be off to the right.
Where was this located at?
This is next to the east wall of the hallway, so not far from where that blood stain is that we just looked at.
And why did you take particular note of the fact that there was an earring on the ground there?
Again, you have an earring lying on the ground which would be consistent with struggle or fleeing or, movement of Brandy Peters dropping an earring as she's moving down the hallway. So various different indicators that just show what's occurring, movement out of the bedroom and down the hallway and toward the front of the house.
How close in proximity is this earring located relative to the overturned lamp?
If memory serves me, it's not far from there, that it's on the opposite side of the hallway in that general vicinity.
Now we're out into the living room, so this would be our view if we had just exited the hallway and came out into the main area of the house right there?
That's correct. Yeah.
What, if anything, do you take note of here?
Well, here, of course, you've got various items that are kind of scattered about on the floor, a plant that's overturned on the floor. So again, indicators of struggle or some type of rapid movement through there. You know, it could be somebody actually physically struggling through there, or it could be simply somebody's moving rapidly and, you know, having to balance themselves or touch things along the way and knocking things over. But it just certainly shows that there are things that are out of place, which would be consistent either with struggle or somebody fleeing.
Appears to be a picture of the exterior of the house. What, if any, significance were you attributing to this photograph?
There's actually several bloodstain patterns outside, primarily over here on this wall, right outside the front door. And what's indicated by it is we're still looking at fairly small quantities of blood here. So in comparison to the amount of blood in the foyer, what that indicates is that Brandy Peters would have fled down the hallway out the front door and then been stopped in that location. There's some blood spatter indicating some injuries perhaps being inflicted there before she's moved back inside into the foyer, and then the bulk of the injuries and the bloodletting occurs at the foyer just inside the front door.
You were just talking about the impact spatter on the siding outside the front door. Is this what we're looking at now?
Yes. So here you actually have some defined impact spatter, which would be consistent with a blunt force event, some type of an impact to blood that causes it to be distributed on the wall right there. There's also a swipe mark in that same general area.
What direction is the swipe mark going?
That swipe actually is going, and I think the next slide shows a close-up of it. So it's actually going this way, which would be back toward the front door.
Okay. What about the impact spatter above that?
That impact spatter is showing that it looks like several different directions of impact, which would indicate more than one impact. But what you have is various different, like this one here, laterally right to left. So you have one that's sort of going in this particular direction. You have one that's going in this direction. Okay, and you have one that's downward this way. And so, again, because you have several different directions that are opposing one another, it would mean that there's likely more than one impact that occurs here in the vicinity of that wall.
Now, when we have impact spatter going in opposite directions, as is depicted right here, it looks like some of the impact spatter is moving left, right, and downward, and then you have some of the spatter moving right to left and upward on the right side of the photograph there. What, if anything, is that indicative of?
Changing directions of force. So, you know, for example, if you had a person and you were just hitting them the same way repeatedly, then you should get impacts that would be similar in direction. When you see ones that have here, we have directions that are completely contrary to one another, then it generally is indicating that you have changing directions of force. Most commonly, that's because you actually have some type of struggle going on, but it can be just somebody hits a person one way with a weapon and then swings it back another way, things like that.
Can multi-directional impact spatter also be indicative of being struck at the same time from two different positions? That is to say, two different people striking you from different positions?
Yes, that could cause it.
I see here you've noted the lines of convergence. What does that mean?
That's where crime scene investigators had, if you take individual bloodstains that are part of a pattern and you draw lines through them, what you're seeking to do is bring them back to where those lines all converge, because that, and then we can do some angle calculations and figure out what's called an area of origin, excuse me, which is sort of an area of where the blood spatter originated from. So if it's, say, an impact to a person, then that's generally the area where the wound is, where the blood is. That's the area that's being impacted, and that's where the blood originated from.
Okay. And the lines of convergence as it relates to this impact spatter here, enable you to make any kind of determination about what the point of origin was?
Those lines of convergence are actually kind of coming up and separating, which means the convergence area would be down in here. And if you look, the reference is that sort of doorknob height. So that means that that blood would have originated from somewhere around in that height, out away from the wall some distance. To know the distance, you'd have to do angle calculations, and there's some other things that weren't really done with this. But just in general, in terms of the height of where it would be, it's not up here. That event would have been down in here where these lines would come together and converge.
What are we looking at in this photo?
This is just showing the, again, where we are in reference to the front door. So there's a picture of the front door, and that impact spatter is over here to the right of the front door.
Is this on the exterior of the front door?
This is, yes, this is the exterior of the front door. So there's a swipe mark and transfer pattern.
What, if anything, do the swipe and transfer patterns on the exterior of the front door indicate to you?
The swipes are fairly low, and the transfer pattern, again, you can see kind of, here's the doorknob height. So you're sort of in the middle of the door there, but what it means is that the transfer pattern means something with blood on it touched the door. Swipe mark means something with blood on it moved across in that location in the door. This is all just kind of consistent with that you have struggle, goes outside, begins to increase in the outside portion, right outside the front door. And then Brandy Peters ends up back inside, just inside the front door where the blood spatter significantly increases.
And we're looking here at the front door again. What caused all that purple stuff we see in the photograph here? Is this the same Leuco crystal violet that was utilized inside the foyer there?
Yes, that's what that would be, is from chemical processing trying to enhance any blood impressions there.
And we see it on the door as well as on the ground, on the concrete outside the door. Was any of the chemical processing utilized on the blood spatter that's on the wall to the right side of this photograph right here?
No.
If you were directing or overseeing processing of this scene, why, if at all, would you have wanted the wall there with the impact spatter enhanced chemically as well?
Generally, you would want to do a series of steps for enhancing using alternate light source, chemical enhancement, various things like that in any areas where you potentially have blood. A chemical that I often used also is Luminol, which is very sensitive to small amounts of blood, but you can find a lot of patterns and things that may not be readily apparent. So generally what I would do is process any areas where I had any indication that there had been blood deposited, simply because you often with chemicals bring up things that you just simply never saw. I've had cases, for example, where I've processed using luminol in areas where there had been some blood, and I end up finding a trail of footprints leading away from there to a bathroom sink, where somebody who had committed a murder went to the bathroom sink to clean up. So until you actually do any of that type of enhancement and processing, you don't really know what you're going to find.
Okay. And are there any advantages to using luminol over the Leuco crystal violet that was used in this case?
It can just sort of depend on the nature of what you have. I mean, one disadvantage to luminol is that you have to have an area that's completely dark or very close to completely dark. And you also have the results basically glow, so it doesn't last long, and it's very difficult to photograph in comparison to Leuco crystal violet. Once you're done, you have results, you have plenty of time to be able to photograph it and document it. But sometimes it becomes a matter of determining what it is that you're looking for, whether you're trying to enhance where you already see some type of impression or pattern versus looking for blood that you cannot see. Luminol is better for showing blood that you just simply don't see. But then you also do have to give consideration to various surfaces and how that particular chemical reacts to that surface. How does it, what happens when you attempt to do things with it? But there's more than one option out there, basically.
Okay. Any problem or issue with the use of Leuco crystal violet, or is that fine given the totality of the circumstances here?
Leuco crystal violet is perfectly fine for blood enhancement, particularly in the areas where you already see blood and you're simply trying to see if you can get more detail in a pattern.
Okay. What are we looking at in this photograph?
This is just another photograph that shows the front door without all the chemicals, the stain from the Leuco crystal violet on it.
And prior to chemical processing, what's observable here in terms of blood spatter?
You actually have some on the ground right outside, which would be the concrete patio right outside the front door. You have some dripped blood areas here, and you have some transfer patterns in here. So again, things that indicate that there's struggle going on. The intensity is increasing, and this is has moved outside and then moves back into the foyer area.
So after they've moved back inside here, what's the first thing you're looking at with respect to the body, its position, and the blood transfer around the body?
Well, here, one of the biggest things that's different from the rest of what you've seen so far is just simply the amount of blood spatter. We go from areas where you have a few small stains here and there in different locations to a foyer area where you have significant blood spatter. You have blood spatter all the way up this door, all the way up to the area above the door, on the wall over here, which would be on toward the west end of the foyer. And of course, significant amounts of transfers, blood saturation, transfers on the lower end of the door. What that means then is that the bulk of these injuries, particularly the blunt force injuries, that's happening here.
Okay.
So
After she is moving or is moved back inside, that's when she's going to suffer the majority of the injuries, including the fatal injury to the forehead.
that's correct.
What are you taking note of with respect to the doorknob and deadbolt right there?
Mainly just showing that you have the significant amounts of blood spatter around here. Doorknob gives you some height reference. You're roughly halfway up the door, and you can see that the blood spatter goes even in very heavy concentrations up here, up above the door. And if we come over to the wall to the right, we're still at the height, up at the top edge or above the door. And basically, we've got really heavy blood spatter concentration going all the way up inside this foyer.
Are you able to tell the directionality of that?
There's really multiple different directions, because you can see just right in here you have some areas where you have blood that's coming upward like this. You have areas up here where you have blood that's coming, some of it's almost straight into the wall, some of it coming downward here. So there's a variety of different directions. And this blood here, because of all the different directions and the different areas of concentration of the stains, you're looking at multiple blunt force impacts and cast off that's associated with that. Cast off being that you're swinging an object or weapon and blood is being cast from it and striking the wall.
This is just for orientation, this next slide?
Again, this is just another photograph where you can see that the various different amounts of blood. Obviously, her body's not here, so you can see that the concentration of transfer blood here. So this means that there's a lot of movement that took place by somebody that's close to the ground, and the broken window and the tearing of the curtain and those things.
Okay. Now the
Yes.
Okay. So you're talking about the different types of spatter we have on both walls there, as well as multiple transfer patterns on the door and the floor. In terms of your experience evaluating crime scenes, what does the variety and quantity of blood spatter and blood transfer in the foyer here indicate to you relative to the intensity of the stroke that took place?
Here you're in the very intense blunt force impact. When you're getting blood spatter of this nature with that much volume distributed over that much of an area, these are very forceful impacts to do that. We do in training where you'll actually create impacts like this, and it takes a lot of effort. We'll do things like saturate it. You take a sponge and saturate it with blood, and then strike it. Put it on a on a 4x4 and strike it, and do things like that. And to try to get that much blood spatter, it's very forceful. So this means you're looking at forceful impacts, and then also the height of the blood, how much you have it distributed all the way up, all the way above the door, high up in the room, is indicative of a long weapon, something with some length to it, not just simply a short, heavy object, but something with some length to it.
What does it indicate when you have a downward motion indication for a particular sample of blood spatter? For example, you had indicated some of the ones above the door there present in large volume. We're moving downward. What does that mean?
Well, downward, for example, here when you have some of this blood where you actually have some downward drops, that can be from, and is most likely from here, from cast off as an object is being swung downward. So if you've got a fairly long object, you're swinging it overhead, you're casting blood off of it, and that blood is coming in, hitting this wall, or being cast and coming downward as the object is swung. And of course, if you consider that you have a lot of transfers with multiple different directions here, then what you likely have is Brandy Peters low down toward the floor being beaten by somebody who's swinging or wielding a weapon coming down on her, striking downward and swinging it downward. Some of this blood spatter that you're seeing here is from the impacts, and you're getting upward directions of drops because the impact is occurring lower and the blood is then being distributed up the door from the actual impact. But most of what you're seeing that's up high, that's not coming from the impact itself, that's coming from cast off as a weapon is swung down toward her.
If that cast off you were talking about right there and then to the top of the door is being caused by someone swinging downward, that would require them to be some distance back swinging towards the door. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. Now there was also blood spatter discovered behind that curtain. Is that correct? On the door itself? That white curtain near the top of the door?
Yes.
Okay. Now, a person swinging forward and facing the door wouldn't be able to deposit the blood spatter behind the curtain, correct? That would require somebody to be on the other side of Ms. Peters' body, closer to the door?
Right. To get the stuff behind the curtain, what you'd have to do is either have impact spatters that are coming upward behind it from underneath, or cast off spatters that are coming down behind it from up above it.
Okay. What are we looking at in this next photograph?
This is showing the east wall of the foyer, and again, you have significant amounts of blood spatter up high, going all the way up the wall that's depicted in the photograph. And similarly, some different directions, so a lot of downward stuff here. And that's, again, consistent with the cast-off spatter of a weapon that's being wielded and is being wielded in different directions.
This photograph that there's large impact spatter traveling downward. What does that mean? What if any significance does that
in order to get the spatters that are traveling downward, most likely you're talking about cast off. The impacts you'll get up this high, for them to be traveling downward, they would have had to originate somewhere higher than that, or they would have to arc over, but they would have to be fairly high impacts. For cast off, that's different. You can use particularly with a longer weapon, you can fling blood at all types of heights and have it coming downward. So a lot of this that you see in here is from actual impacts, meaning when the weapon strikes, hits the blood that's already there, blood is distributed out and it hits the walls around it. And the higher stuff is likely coming more from cast off, though you could get some impact spatters if you're talking about a fairly high impact and fairly forceful impact.
How would the weapon being wielded have to impact, and in what direction would the person wielding it have to be facing in order to deposit that cast off at the top of the photograph here?
You'd have to be swinging a weapon downward this way. So the blood would have to come off the weapon and then come downward and strike the wall from higher than where it is. Now you can get a certain amount of arcing of it that, you could cast it off and it sort of goes up and then comes back down, but you won't get a whole lot of that. Mostly when you're seeing cast off like that, it's coming off the weapon and it's coming downward as the weapon's being swung from out here, and you're getting all this blood that's traveling downward.
So that cast off would have been caused by a downward motion of the weapon being used while facing this wall?
Yes, likely facing the wall. Not necessarily having to be square to the wall, but that the weapon is being brought in a downward fashion, basically toward the wall. You wouldn't be swinging it out across the other side of the foyer and getting that. That would be coming from being in that direction. You can, though, also get with cast-off spatter what's called back cast-off, which is when you bring a weapon back to basically get ready for the next swing. As you bring it back, you can be casting off. So you could actually get cast off like that if the wall was to your back and you were swinging in front of you in the opposite direction.
Okay. So in any event, the weapon that deposited this cast off has to be moving perpendicular to the door. It's either moving forward towards this wall, or if the person is facing the opposite wall, they would be casting it off as they come back to strike again.
Basically so, in order to get it on that wall. So you could get some if you're sort of at an angle to the wall, but you would be basically in the direction of that wall, toward that wall.
Previous photograph. All right, we're back looking at the front door here. What were you wanting to emphasize regarding the front door photo again?
Well, here again, you have, showing that you have all this transfer blood. There's a lot of movement in blood here, low, and of course you'll see there's some over here on this wall as well, various different transfers. So what that indicates is that this isn't static. She's not in one position being beaten repeatedly and causing all this different blood, that she's moving about. That's why we have a lot of blood here where there's transfers, yet you saw in the final rest point for her was basically out here in the foyer, away from that area. But the fact that you have transfers over here on this wall, you have all these transfers here, that this is a fairly dynamic thing that's going on. So for a good while, she's struggling, and there's a lot of movement going on of somebody, whether it's her or an attacker or whom, but somebody moving about and causing these various different areas of blood transfers.
So it's not as if she's just knocked unconscious as soon as she gets back inside the door. She's mobile and moving from position to position, up and down for some period of time.
There's a lot of movement that's taking place, that's correct. So, because sometimes you'll see beating cases where everything's just concentrated in one area, and that's indicative of a person, as you mentioned, it's just basically rendered unconscious. They're not fighting or resisting in any way, and the person that's attacking them is just repeatedly striking them in a similar manner. That is not what you have here. You have very much the opposite of that you have blood in all different directions, transfers in all different types of directions, so that means that there's a lot of dynamic movement going on here. And that can be attributed to her, but it could also be attributed to other people moving about as they're attacking her.
You've indicated here that the blood is radiating upward near the top of the door. What does that mean? As opposed to the other cast off you talked about where it was moving downward.
You actually have some, in addition to these downward drops and stuff in here, you have a number of drops that are fairly close to straight in up there at the top of the door. So again, it's indicative of the fact that there's some type of a longer weapon being used. You'll get with short weapon hammers, hard objects that are short and things like that. You'll often have high volumes like this, but it'll demarcate, at a certain particular point up the wall. Usually right around the height of wherever the wound is. So if a person's being beaten in the head and they're maybe in a seated position, then where their head would be in a seated position, the blood is right around that area and below. When you see blood like this, where it's going all the way up the walls, you even have some stuff in the ceiling and things like that, that's indicative of a longer weapon being used, because you're actually having to project the blood in those areas and be able to get it up high enough to put it above the top of the door and basically all the way up inside that foyer.
Would a 32 caliber revolver, is that of the length that you're discussing for what could have caused that cast off above the door, or would the object causing that cast off have been longer than that?
It would be something longer than that. Exactly what, it could be baseball bat length, it could be crowbar length, it could be something like that, but you're talking about something that's got to have at least some length to it. Because when you're swinging an object, the amount of blood and where the blood goes is a combination of how much force you're applying, but also how long the particular weapon is. If you can imagine, if I took a ball and I throw it in my hand like this, I can't throw it nearly as far as if I put it on the end of a stick and then throw it, because it's in engineering terms, it's what we call a moment arm. You're able to increase the amount of force. Same thing like with a wrench. If you put a longer wrench on a bolt that's hard to turn, then it gets easier to turn. You're able to apply a greater moment of force, and that's what happens here. You're able to apply a greater moment of force, and you're able to reach higher, and so you can fling blood all over a room, including ceiling and above the doors and things like that you can't do with a really short object.
Here we're looking at the blood transfer patterns at the bottom of the door. Anything of significance here?
Mainly just another view of it, showing that you can see, there are a number of different directions, and if you look at all this feathering in there, that tells you things about the direction of it, and you've got a lot of movement in various different directions. So again, very dynamic right here, that this is whatever's moving around in here, and of course, given the height, that's consistent with Brandy Peters' head if she's down on the ground while struggling. But whatever it is that's moving in there is moving around quite a bit.
So even if she's on the floor at this point with her head towards the door, she's not yet unconscious. She's still moving at that point.
That's what it would indicate, is that she's still moving at this point, because there's a lot of movement in this blood, and that would be consistent with the level of her head if she's down on the ground. But this is not where she comes to rest, and there's obviously a lot of movement in different directions. So that would be consistent with her still struggling at that point, or some other movement going on. But typically in a beating case, when you see that, it's because the victim is still struggling.
What are you noting of significance on the west wall here?
You got some impact spatters, again, up here fairly high with some downward drops. Impact spatters over here that are higher, that's ones where she's likely standing and being struck. So the combination of these various impacts here, the other wall in this area, as well as the blood low, indicates that, again, once she's outside, comes back inside, beating continues, she's probably not on the ground immediately. She's being struck, and then, of course, eventually she's going to be suffering more and more injury, and then eventually ends up on the floor, and then there's more injury inflicted until she's finally killed.
You've noted a transfer pattern about a quarter of the way up the wall there. What, if any, significance is that of?
That's, again, just another transfer. That looks like that could very well be a hand, which would be consistent, again, if she's struggling, and when you consider that there are other transfers down in here, then that could be either from her or from an attacker getting blood on their hand, touching the wall for, either in balancing themselves or trying to use the wall to maintain control of what they're doing.
This is a close-up of the same?
Yes.
So we see around the possible handprint there that there's impact spatter at that height as well?
You've got some drops coming downward and some other areas, and then, of course, the what appears to be likely a hand impression on the wall.
How about lower down on the wall? There's some additional transfer marks you've noted.
Yes, there's some additional transfer, and I think the next slide actually shows the fact that there's various different directions in these transfers. So again, what you have here is quite dynamic. Somebody's moving around and moving in different directions with blood on an object that's touching the wall and moving around.
How many homicide investigations do you think did you say you've worked on?
As a police crime scene investigator, probably several hundred, couple of hundred, and then I've reviewed hundreds as a consultant since then.
In terms of the measure of the fight or struggle that Miss Peters exhibited, how dynamic was this fight? How hard did she struggle?
It's a pretty dynamic struggle. I would say that most of the beating deaths that I've worked would be indicative of less struggle than this. Now, I've seen some that were equal to, if not surpassing this, but you very often see less indications of struggle, more rapid incapacitation versus here where there's just this movement all over the foyer indicated. So there's a good bit of struggle that went on.
What are you noting in this next photograph on the floor here?
Here you have, on the floor, you have some impact stains here, and this side of the floor you do not. And this is, we have a good bit of blood saturation around the floor in here, and then you have some areas of what we call void patterns, or areas where there's here, maybe not quite voids, meaning a complete absence of blood, but the concentrations of blood in certain areas over here is much less than various areas of transfer impressions in the blood.
Okay. This transfer pattern you're noting here, what, if any, significance do you attribute to that?
Well, it just indicates that there's some type of an object that has that pattern to it that came in contact with the floor, had some blood on it, came in contact with the floor in that area. And of course, you sort of have a demarcation in the blood here around her. And this is kind of in that area where we talked about that there's not a, I wouldn't really quite use the term void, but there's a sort of a demarcation in a area where there's just not very much blood in comparison to the other parts of the tile floor.
Is this one of the transfer patterns you were just talking about?
Yes.
All right. What, if anything, did you determine about this particular transfer pattern?
Well, you can see there's some linear patterning to it. And so that can be from footwear or some type of an object that would create that sort of a pattern. So something that has those sort of linear striations in it, had blood on it, and touched the floor at that location.
Okay. Was this one of the probable footwear impressions that you identified, or were you not able to make a determination about this one?
I would say it's most likely footwear impression because of those linear striations. Whatever the object is, it has to have that sort of a patterning to it. So, obviously, there's not a clear pattern where you could look right at it and say that's clearly somebody's foot, but it has linear striations in it, and so, just by analysis of what potential items could be there, footwear would be probably top of the list.
So you may not be able to compare it to, or to identify exactly, just based on the photo that you have there, exactly what shoe make or brand or type that is, but you're able to classify it as a probable footwear impression?
I think so. I mean, I would certainly treat it as that, as a crime scene investigator. I would be photographing that and looking at doing enhancement and things like that to try to bring out more detail, but that would be the way that I would at least be treating it, as though it's a potential footwear impression.
Now, did you have an opportunity to compare this impression to the shoe impression standards that were taken from the first responding officers?
Yes, there were some standards that were taken, and I didn't find anything in the standards that appeared to match with that particular pattern.
Okay. This next transfer pattern being noted, is that a different one than we were just talking about?
Yes.
What, if anything, were you taking note of relative to that transfer pattern?
There's actually some additional swipe areas here. So this in particular is a transfer pattern, and again, it looks like potentially a hand, could be from a foot, but could be from a hand. So the main thing with that is, again, you have a transfer pattern, you want to consider any type of enhancement that you might do with it. Is there any type of ridge detail in it? So if it's from a hand or a bare foot, do we get any ridge detail that could be identified back to a particular person? And then, taking comparison quality photographs to show that detail to be able to match it to something else.
So this was not one of the probable shoe impressions that you were able to identify, correct? This is just a transfer pattern of some type.
Right. There were two that were denoted in the previous slide. This one's the one up against the wall, and then there's another one sort of in the middle of the foyer, and that one is on, I think, on the next slide here. And that one is likely footwear. That you actually have sort of these kind of rectangular impressions right there, something like you might see on the lug of a boot or a shoe that has a work shoe type pattern to it. But that would be, again, something that I would treat as potential footwear impression. It appears to be likely from some type of footwear.
Okay, so this is the second potential shoe impression in the Foyer area there. Were you also able to compare this probable shoe impression to the shoe impression standards taken from law enforcement?
Yes.
And
I'm going to object. He was gave a lot of certification and possibly processing, but he didn't. I don't believe he was certified in actually doing comparison identification of footprints. That's what I.
Let's not get into making speaking objections, please. You know better than that. If you want to be heard, ask to go sidebar.
yes,
All right.
We'll go sidebar.
You can proceed, Mr. Prince.
thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Knox, I just want to clarify as we go through these potential shoe impressions here. You don't do the actual inclusion, which is to say, if you have a standard to compare and say, yes, that's the shoe, you don't do that. You do the class comparisons and exclusions, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Were you able to exclude law enforcement, the law enforcement shoe impression standards as being the source of this probable footwear impression right here?
Yes. it did not appear to be from the standards that were provided.
In this next photo, you've identified a blood droplet right there near the carpet line. What, if any, significance did you attribute to that?
You have a single blood drop, meaning so blood was just dripped from above. It's a fairly round drop, so there's not any real movement associated with that. But as you'll see in the next slide that shows a close-up of it, that blood drop is actually sitting on top of some transfer stain. That means the transfer stain occurred first, and then the blood got dripped onto that particular area.
And what, if any, conclusion did you draw about that particular transfer stain?
That transfer stain doesn't really have any particular patterning to it, but it means that the struggling had occurred. It's a transfer stain on the floor, and so this could very well be from struggle that has moved around on the floor, and then this dripped blood occurs later on, which means that this is most likely being dripped by an offender. The biggest key when you see that at a crime scene is that when you have blood that's being dropped after the bulk of events have taken place, then it means you have some type of a sustained blood source. And that's usually associated with an attacker who has sustained an injury during the course of an attack and then is now dripping blood. So that's an area that you would want to get a sample of and then compare that and see whether or not that's victim's blood or whether or not that is coming from another person. Because obviously if it's not the victim's blood and it's coming from another person and you don't have any evidence of any other victim here in this particular location, then that would be blood that's coming from somebody who's involved.
Now, was this particular blood droplet that you've been referring to swabbed and tested in this case, or no?
I didn't find any indications that it was ever sampled, and certainly if it wasn't sampled, then it couldn't have been tested.
Is this another transfer pattern you've identified here?
Yes. This is an area where there was a blood sample taken from the foyer floor, and you see the scale was placed in that area.
And you don't do the DNA analysis yourself?
That's correct. I do not.
This is a close-up of the same impression?
Yes, that area there is where one of the blood samples that was collected from the foyer was collected.
Was this one of the probable shoe impressions that you identified, or not?
No, I think this was an area that the crime scene investigators identified as an area that they wanted to sample.
We don't see any of the circular droplets like you were talking about before, consistent with a still constant source of blood. Is that correct?
That's correct. In that area, that is correct.
What are we looking at in this photograph?
This is just a close-up of that area where the blood sampling took place, but there's potentially some impression again. If you see, you've got some linear striations here. So like this one here, you have one here, and you have one there. So not a lot of detail to it, but an area that could potentially have been another footwear impression.
And were you able to identify this one as a probable shoe impression, or is this the same one you were talking about just a second ago that you weren't able to say that it's a shoe impression, just an impression of some kind?
It's an impression of some kind. I think probably the biggest thing that I noted with that is that that's an area where enhancement would be good to try, see if there is any more detail there that could help you to identify whether it is footwear impression or not.
Okay. And I meant to ask you this before, relative to the two probable footwear impressions you have identified so far. You said that they both excluded the officers as a potential source. Did you also compare them to each other to determine whether they were from the same source or a different source?
Well, they have different patterns to them. Now, the only thing you'd have to consider there is whether or not you're looking at different portions of a particular piece of footwear, but they're very different in terms of one, again, had those sort of linear striations, and one had more of a lug pattern to it. So that would be the issue, is that they are very different from one another, but not having complete impressions, it would be, you can't say for certain that it's not just two different portions of the same footwear.
It would essentially require a boot heel and a tennis shoe toe area on the shoe if it was going to come from one shoe, correct?
It would be a shoe that would have to have different patterns. It'd have to have both one portion with some linear striations on it and one portion with this lug type pattern to it.
What are these next points that you've marked in the blood saturation?
There is some additional transfer patterns that are in that area, those two circled areas.
Close-ups of each of those?
Yes, in fact, the next slide kind of shows some close-up areas, and one of the things that's noted here, you see these various different drops that are pointed out, and it says skeletonization. A skeletonized blood drop is one that if you deposit a blood drop and it starts to dry, they dry from the outside in. So the outside edges of it will dry faster than the interior portion of it. And so if you have one that partially dries and then something touches it, it will remove the liquid blood from the middle, but not the dried blood from the outer edges. So you'll get this brown stain that's empty in the middle, and that's what we call a skeletonized blood drop. So again, you have various different blood stains here, deposited, allowed to dry, and these are small stains, so when I say allowed to dry, that can be on the order of seconds, not necessarily that there's a long period of time going here, but seconds to minutes is what it would take to do that. And then something touches it and removes blood from it.
Is there any indication for this particular sample of what would have caused the skeletonization?
There's some patterning in here that, again, could be from footwear. You have some various different sort of rectangular shapes, such as that shape right there. And you have some other rectangular shapes here. So that could potentially be from footwear. It's just, there's not a whole lot of detail there to know. But this one here is sort of outlining it. There's a skeletonized drop right there. And then you have this sort of rectangular pattern that could be like a lug from a boot or shoe. But there's not a lot of detail, so I wouldn't really want to say that that's, in fact, from Footwear Impression, but very well could be.
So this isn't one of the identified probable footwear impressions?
No, I think that there's some type of transfer impression is the way I would say it. Because clearly you do have those rectangular shapes, but whether or not that's footwear or there might be some other object that has that rectangular shaping to it, but something has touched in that area, left that shape to it, and has removed some of the blood from those blood drops.
What are we looking at in this next photograph?
There's, again, some transfer here. This movement right in here, this looks like possibly hand, fingers as well. So again, another area that would be where you would want to consider potentially you could get ridge detail, and you may enhance that with an alternate light source. You may enhance that with chemicals to see if there's additional ridge detail there that might be identifiable to say, fingers or toes.
Now we're over on the carpet, just a few feet away from where Ms. Peters' body was found. What, if anything, of significance do you note there on the carpet?
This is mainly just an area of saturated blood. So saturated blood generally means either a lot of dripping in one area or some blood source was in that area for a long enough period of time to deposit that blood. it wouldn't take that long if you had a fairly profuse bleeding. Something could have touched it, been there for a couple seconds, and then deposited that. But there's a good bit of saturated blood in that one particular area.
So if that were Ms. Peters, for example, she would have had to either fall in there or been hovering above that area, maybe on her hands and knees to deposit that quantity of blood in that place?
That's correct, yes.
Next photo appears to be of the bottom of Ms. Peters' socks. She wasn't wearing any shoes when she was down. What, if anything, of significance did you note about the bottom of her socks?
Well, the main thing there is that any potential footwear impressions that you have, she's not wearing shoes. So the only thing you would get from there would be sock or cloth impressions from the bottom of her feet. You wouldn't expect to see any type of linear striations, lug patterns, or anything like that from her feet.
Okay. Next, you've noted a shovel in the area of Ms. Peters' body. What, if any, significance did you attach to that?
The shovel, of course, the consideration there is whether or not that would have been potentially a weapon or been involved in some way. It's located not very far from her body, but the biggest thing is that there's almost a complete absence of blood on that shovel. There were some police reports indicating no obvious signs of blood. I think there has been at least one drop or a small amount of blood identified on the shovel, but that would not be consistent with the type of blood I would expect to see on the shovel if it had been used to inflict those kind of injuries and all that blood spatter. I mean, you can see the amounts of blood that you have over in here and that you have over in here in this saturation area, and any weapon associated with that would likewise have significant quantities of blood on it, not a small drop or small quantity of blood. It would be covered in it.
We'll probably do for a break, wouldn't you, at this stopping point?
This is a fine point, Your Honor.
All right, why don't we take 10 minutes? Either side need anything?
No, Your Honor.
All right, I'll let the jury step out this step.